All right, hello everyone. I'm delighted today for the EG seminar to have the first one held in the David Attenborough building and to welcome fellow Irishman Oisin Mulcahy, who's come down from the University of Edinburgh to talk to us about a whole bunch of work he's been doing on species distribution modeling. Now, he's also used to be here about 10 years ago now, I think, wasn't it, over at Microsoft Research. This is a return back to Cambridge. And so if you'd like to speak to Oisin afterwards, just do feel free to hang out and ask any questions. But in the meanwhile, take it away and let us tell us about species distribution model.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's great to be back here. It's so good to see so many people. So do feel free to kind of stop me along the way in this talk. I'm very happy to kind of clarify things that are not clear or dive into more details on specific things. So don't hold back if you have any questions. So normally at the start of my talk, I spend like a minute explaining my very complicated pronunciation of my name, but Neil English, so I don't have to waste time on that. So for the last, I guess it was maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, we started working with iNaturalist. I'm guessing most people here probably have heard of iNaturalist. Yeah. And so iNaturalist is this pretty cool citizen science initiative where up to recently, or when I last checked this during the week, there is about 230 million observations. Typically, that means a location in space and time with an associated image of 500,000 different species by over maybe several million people. So there's this huge distributed global network of people who are monitoring or at least providing data that hopefully will be useful for understanding biodiversity. And so actually my background is computer vision. So we first started talking to iNaturalist for this challenge of what is in these images. So they had this problem that their community was exploding in size, and it was becoming a bottleneck because they were previously requiring humans to manually identify what was in these images. And so this was kind of around the time before a lot of the AI stuff that we have now even worked. And so it was just kind of mind-blowing to us to think like, how the hell are we going to build AI systems that could identify tens of thousands of species, really complex fine-grained categories? And so, it turned out a lot of work on their part, that they made something that works quite well. So now they have this kind of like computer vision in the loop. So in a sense, the task that they're trying to do is just that of given an image I, what is the species Y? It happens to be the case that this is not just like two options. There literally is 100,000 different options in their current models. But in practice, the way that I think most knowledgeable humans would approach that question is not just what species in the image. It's given that it's observed at some location X, what is in that image. So you can think of that as this like pretty crucial additional piece of information that is needed to actually perform this task, but it's traditionally completely excluded from a lot of these computer vision models. Or image recognition models. And so again, you could just factorize out this kind of quantity that we want to estimate in terms of two components. So one is the thing that we really understand in computer vision machine learning. It is given the image, what the species, okay? What's the probability of that? And that's some kind of deep network, it's some CNN or visual transformer or whatever you want to use. But this next bit wasn't so clear to us, at least, a few years ago when we started. What is this next component, this kind of prior, geographical prior that could inform these predictions? And so again, think of this as given some location, what are the species that are likely to be present at that location? Great thing about working with these kinds of organizations like iNaturalist, again, it isn't just that there's the images there that have this rich source of underlying metadata as to where they've been observed. So this is the kind of raw observation history for this particular species, where dark colors mean more likely that it's present. Or sorry, no, not more likely it's present, more observations of the species in those locations. But obviously that's quite different from the underlying range. And so this is a kind of BirdLife International derived range map. And so you can see here, there's huge gaps if I flick back and forward between those two. So clearly this isn't good enough to build our prior, or at least directly. We need to be able to approach something like a more accurate range map to be able to actually, to fill in this module that's missing at the start. Okay, and so again, this is probably very obvious to most of you here. As a computer scientist, it was kind of surprising for me to realize how few things actually are mapped and how much limited knowledge we have about extensive kind of range maps for most species. And that's obviously an issue because of this lack of knowledge is hampering our ability to inform conservation priorities. Again, I don't have to tell anyone here about that. The good news is that there is this biodiversity data kind of exploding really and growing at amazing amazing trend. So this is GBIF. So GBIF is kind of this aggregator of a lot of other sources like iNaturalist, eBird, a lot of national initiatives and so on. And so you can see they recently, I think just towards the end of last year, they crossed 3 billion occurrences, where I think in their parlance, an occurrence is an observation again in space and time of a particular species. So again, there is this amazing source of location data that's out there that we could start using to assess and predict the spatial distributions of species. Okay, it has its biases. Again, I think this is going to be quite clear to people. The places where actually there's a lot of richness is not necessarily the places where citizen scientists go on these platforms. And this is just a kind of a limitation right now of the kind of global north bias of these types of platforms. And also there's huge taxonomic biases on these platforms. So this is a kind of a histogram of a set of species from iNaturalist, where we're looking here at the counts, number of observations per species. So again, there's a lot of species, log axis here, which have a small few that have lots of observations, and vice versa. There's a huge long tail that have very limited. So we have this huge imbalance in our data. Okay, so we're getting more into the meat of it now. So again, the question here we're trying to tackle is just this quintessential species distribution modeling question. Obviously, there's a huge and really rich literature on this topic, going back to things like Maxent, and obviously before that. It's interesting, actually, Maxent, I guess, first kind of appeared at a machine learning venue as well. So there's a lot of kind of like rich intersection over the years between machine learning and kind of statistical ecology on these problems. Then there's kind of a huge amount of really super interesting work on kind of more, let's say, like Bayesian modeling, hierarchical models of it, building into these kinds of models more explicit knowledge about the kind of processes, maybe things about knowledge of occurrences, traits, biology, all this kind of stuff. That's quite cool. But more recently, we've seen this kind of rise of the application of, let's call it like modern deep learning or machine learning work to tackle this problem of species distribution modeling. And so what are the kind of real benefits you get here is you get a lot of the kind of the desirable properties that modern deep learning solutions have. They allow you to kind of integrate heterogeneous data sources. You can bring in like remote sensing imagery, you can bring in climate information, you can bring in raw point observations all inside of the one model. You have these you can build really complex models to capture really complex interactions. You also get a lot of the tooling and software infrastructure around training these models. So these things can be trained on, GPUs, and so you can do this really efficiently. You have really well kind of orchestrated libraries, PyTorch, TensorFlow, all these kinds of things that allow you to actually program up your model. So you benefit from a lot of this kind of work that's gone in AI, or in AI, and you can apply it in this ecology domain. And again, yeah, there's, like I alluded to there, there's kind of lots of works now where people are taking in this kind of remote sensing imagery, other sources of information to try and capture more complex relationships. And that's really where we're grounded at the moment, is we're trying to build these types of models. Okay, so this probably again is probably a bit less useful for this audience, but this is quite a cool review for a more computer science, machine learning oriented audience on species distribution models. So actually, I think this is a really nice summary and overview. And actually, maybe it's even interesting here because it might give people a perspective of how we're viewing the problem from the computer science side, potentially in the wrong way. So maybe there's some interesting kind of points to be communicated back to us about like how we're viewing this and if we're fixating on the wrong aspects of this. Great. Okay, so what is the task? That was a bit of setup. The task really we're interested in is range estimation. So I want to, and I'll explain a lot of these terms along the way. I want to train a compact model that can estimate the probability a species of interest is present at a given location. And so why compact model? We want it to be compact because we want to be able to, yes, ultimately generate really accurate range maps. So that's our dream. But also we want to be able to enable use cases whereby right now we have people who on their phone can do image classification on these kind of platforms. You can download apps like Seek, to some extent iNaturalist. You can do automatic ID on your phone. but we'd like to be able to also include these kind of geographical priors on your phone. So you could go out potentially to a location where you have no internet access and still be able to get good predictions from these models. Yeah, and so we're going to train these models on this kind of noisy, opportunistically collected citizen science observation data where we have no confirmed absences. Yeah, okay, so actually out of interest, how many are kind of more computer science type people versus people who are more on the ecology side? Okay, so it's more ecology oriented. Okay, so presence absence data, you know, this would be kind of like the most desirable source of training data that we could have, where we'd have each icon here represents an observation in space, and we'd have either confirmed presence of something or a confirmed absence of it. In practice, again, we have this much more impoverished information where we have this opportunistically gathered presence data, where each dot might, in this example, for instance, come from a different person even collecting it. And we've no real explicit knowledge of the collection effort that's gone into this. Okay, so to talk you through a bit about like our framework at a high level. So I'm not really going to go into a lot of details today about how we actually train these models. If people are interested in that, I can definitely talk about it, or you can come grab me afterwards. But my main objective is to kind of really just give a bit of a high level overview of how these models conceptually work. Okay, so we can assume here we have some presence data where each color here represents a different species. So we've got 3 species, and then in this just toy illustration, this is just showing some kind of spatial configuration of them. So the models that we have ultimately, that we're building, ultimately contain two main components, I like to think of it. So one is a location encoder. Okay, so this is a model that takes a coordinate like a latitude and longitude as input and transforms it into some abstract feature space. So one way to think about that is, you know, this abstract representation of space that I get for a particular location, you could think of that as like, maybe that's capturing the kind of environmental conditions that are there. But particularly where you just input those environmental conditions, that's all you have available to the model. Instead, we'd like to be able to learn something about a characterization of that particular location. And we're going to learn it as a result of the signal we're getting from lots of different species. So if there's a certain assemblage of species at location 1 and a different set at location 2, that's telling us something about the underlying environmental structure that's quite different, or at least that's the hypothesis. And if 2 locations had the exact same composition of species, we would be kind of inferring that they have a very similar structure. So you could think of this as some kind of encoding of space that we are going to ultimately learn from data instead of actually explicitly putting it into our model. Okay, so again, just think of this as some function that transforms location X, and you get some vector out of it. And if I apply that function to a different location, I get a different vector out of it. And we'll look at some visualizations a bit later on as to see what the model's actually learned. Okay, so the next piece, and there isn't really many more equations in the talk today, the next piece of the puzzle is a representation of species. Okay, and so again, the way to think about species is they also exist in the same abstract feature space, okay? And the idea is that if I have a species, for example, this green species, if it has a strong affinity to a particular location, that means they have a high similarity. You can think of multiplying these 2 vectors together and getting a very high number. That means that there's a kind of a strong affinity, that thing is likely to be present there. And if it has a very kind of opposite effect, a very negative response, is telling us that the species is not present there according to the model. Or at the very least, ultimately, we're going to train the model to have that structure. And so in the same way we thought of locations having some kind of abstract latent encoding, species also have that as well. So 2 species that are similar to each other in this abstract space encodes the model. It's according to the model, it's saying these species have similar preferences for their ranges, at least based on the data that we've seen. And if the encodings of the species are different, it's the model telling us actually these 2 things are very distinct. And so what's going on here? So again, encoding of location, encoding of species, multiply them together, and just some nonlinear transformation, a sigmoid function that just ensures that number is between 0 and 1. So we have a kind of a probability that species is present at location. So if you're more familiar with like more traditional linear models, you could think of it as your linear model is just this part here. It's some weight vector that you learn, and you have some encoding of location that you multiply by it, and you're getting your output for a species. So it's kind of there's an equivalence there. Is that broadly quite clear to people? Yeah. Okay, great. Do obviously stop me again if anything's not clear. And so once this is trained, this model, now we can take the model, we can input any location we care about or all locations on Earth, and we can generate outputs, and those outputs are continuous scores between 0 and 1 for each species, indicating whether the model thinks the species is present there or not. And so that's kind of what this toy figure, again, I'll show you some real examples in a minute, but that's what this toy figure is showing us. It's that according to this model here, it's got a kind of a high probability for the green species here and blue and red and so on. Okay. So in practice, again, I'm not going into the details really. To train this thing, we're able to train it on many species together. And this is, again, the real strength or benefit of this kind of joint species distribution modeling approach. We're not just training it on one species at a time. We're training it on 50,000 or actually 100,000 now in the latest models jointly inside of the same model. So the high level intuition is that we want gaps that exist in the data to be filled by other species. So we're going to learn to kind of, in some sense, address these data biases and limitations that exist by virtue of the fact that other species, we also have data for them. And so while we might have some kind of gaps in our sampling for X, we might have it in Y. The hope is that, like, because we've learned something about their similarity or dissimilarity, it kind of allows us to complete this picture a bit more. Yeah, and then what's actually quite nice as well, even though this sounds like a lot of data that we train on ultimately, the model itself is this really compact neural network. It's just a couple of nonlinear transformations of your input. So ultimately, this model then just ends up being like 100 megabytes. So it's kind of nothing really in terms of the size, and super quick to evaluate. Okay, so here's a visualization. So what I'm showing you here is I'm going to show you an example of a model that's not trained on a lot of data. Okay, so this is this abstract transformation of the input location that I talked about. This model has learned how to convert a specific lat-long location into some representation. And so this is a model that's trained on a very limited amount of data, so a very small number of observations per species. And what we do is that model then, this vector here, is a big high dimensional, let's say 256 dimensional vector. We just project it down to 3D just so we can visualize it, and we just show you the colors here as that. So it's kind of a compression of the information, but just for visualization. And so you can see that this model has broadly figured out that there's different continents and regions, but beyond that, there's nothing actually particularly interesting in structure there. When we increase the amount of data, so now we're training on potentially 1,000 observations per species. So now we're getting kind of into this million level category, quantities of data. You can see actually that, and again, this is a kind of an older model that we've worked on. You can see that geographical features are starting to emerge a bit more from this model. So we're kind of seeing structures that are kind of being informed just by virtue of the actual species observations that the model has encoded. So in some sense, the model has to come up with some way to encode locations such that they can kind of uniquely support the species that are present at those places. Okay. And yeah, okay. And so in the same way we visualize locations there, we can also jump in and visualize species. So remember, I talked about the idea that species exist in some high dimensional space, and affinity between species indicates their similarities according to the model. Each dot here represents a low dimensional projection of a species. So each little blue dot is one of the 50,000 different species in the model, and it's just compressed down to 2D. People may have heard of TSNE, but you can think of methods like PCA, just a way to visualize this in 2D. And so just to be clear, for example, in this toy illustration I have, let's say I've got 3 different species. They would exist potentially in 3 different locations in this space. But what we can do now is we can actually visualize individual species. So what I'm going to show on the right is the resulting range map for a given species from this embedding up the top. And so on the next slide, I'm going to click it, and it's going to start moving around in the space, and you're going to start seeing how the range map predicted from the model for that species differs. And what you'll observe is that locations that are close to each other, species that are close to each other have similar range maps. So the model in some sense, again, has itself learned to structure, organize the set of species in a way that their similarity in that space is reflective of their range preferences or their range desire. And again, in some cases, it might be kind of hard to see. You can kind of see we're walking around New Zealand at the moment. Now we're in South America, and so on. There you go. Okay, so these are some kind of more qualitative examples as well. We can look at kind of some of the predictions from the model. So again, these are still relatively spatially coarse. Now we're not encoding any in these particular models. We're not encoding any explicit environmental information from remote sensing imagery or any derived climate information in these particular plots. We see stuff that's kind of relatively kind of blurry at the moment, but actually this supports really well our use case, which is helping computer vision. Because if I've got two plant species and they look very similar in terms of the visual appearance, but they have very distinct spatial locations, this is exactly what we need to be able to discriminate between those two things. And again, just a kind of a sampling of some of the outputs of the model here. So yeah, I should have said that. So kind of brighter colors mean higher probability that the species is present according to the model. Okay, so a big part of all of this work as well for us was thinking about ways in which we could quantitatively evaluate the performance of our models and ultimately future models we develop. And this is something we've talked a bit this morning with some of the folks here. So in computer science, or certainly machine learning, it's very metric oriented, and often that is like a negative thing, not necessarily a positive. There's a kind of a fixation on getting a way to numerically quantify the success of a given algorithm. But what we didn't really have was a way to do that well in this case here. And I'm not claiming we do at the moment have a good way to do it, but our current solution for quantitatively evaluating these models is to take kind of, let's say, best in class available predictions from other more complete models that maybe have access to much richer presence absent data, like in the example of eBird status and trends, bird species from North America, so really kind of data rich examples. Or we could look at, for example, IUCN expert derived range maps, and we could kind of carefully curate a subset of those where there is kind of strong agreement with observations that are coming from platforms like iNaturalist. So we would discard an IUCN range map if it didn't, if there was lots of citizen science observations that didn't occur inside of those ranges. So a kind of a step. So you can think of these as we've got like basically expert or model derived ground truth targets that we'd like to approach the similar predictions to those, but from a much weaker impoverished iNaturalist sources of data. And then also we'd like to be able to measure the performance of the model on the tasks that I motivated this from the very start, which is I've got some images, I want to be able to classify them into different species, and I would like to be able to improve classification performance by virtue of using this prior. Okay, so here's some of the kind of quantitative evaluation. So this y-axis is mean average precision. So this is a way of measuring performance. And what we see here is, so these three dots represent three different models. And so what's kind of nice and maybe not too surprising is that as we add more data to the model, performance improves. So okay, I guess a good sanity check, we would want that to happen. But what's interesting here is if I now vary the amount of species that the model's seen, I'm not changing the species that I evaluated on. I'm going to evaluate it on that same set of status and trends, eBird species or IUCN species, but I'm going to start adding in other species that are potentially not necessarily the same. They're not the same ones. They potentially could be even quite unrelated. The model is actually still improving performance. It's not necessarily a dramatic improvement, but it's actually a non-trivial improvement in performance. So in this particular case, we're seeing that the model benefits from seeing more diverse species and benefits in the sense that the predictions are more accurate on a restricted subset of them. So I think this is a kind of a very, in my mind, a very promising direction in the sense that we're seeing the fact that not just adding more data helps, but more diverse data actually helps as well. Yeah, and then kind of qualitatively, we can see some of these things as well. So again, models with very limited amounts of data. What we're showing here is kind of a very coarse spatial scale prediction where green is true positive, red is false positive. As we add more data, we kind of improve those predictions and we kind of even reduce false negatives and so on a bit further. So we have this, again, this benefit of more data helps. Yeah, I guess I don't want to belabor this too much. So, we can kind of quantitatively evaluate, and I don't have slides here today, but we've got much more extensive evaluation against a whole bunch of other models, and we kind of see significant performance improvement, certainly compared to kind of simple traditional things, but also in domains where we use, again, climate variables as input and things like that as well. Okay, so I guess it was maybe nearly a year and a half ago at this stage as well. iNaturalist now deployed this on their platform to assist the computer vision predictions. And what's kind of cool about this is that in computer vision, we slave over like very tiny incremental improvements in performance. So like training massive, huge models just to get a 1% improvement in classification performance. And that is meaningful. Like 1% means that there's like 1 in 100 less mistakes happening on these kind of platforms. But actually, when we add the this geographical prior to the classifier from iNaturalist, that's what you see, this difference between dark green and light green. We're actually getting 10% improvement in performance. And so again, what's kind of crazy to think here, this is nearly 100,000 way classification problem. So there's 100,000 different options that this model has, classes this model has seen, where a class is a species, and it's got to predict one of those 100,000. So a 10% improvement on that is actually a pretty significant jump in performance, which is nice. And this is a kind of like a breakdown on different taxonomic groups or locations on a kind of a trusted subset of images that iNaturalists have created as a kind of validation or test set. Okay, and so then recently, actually just earlier this year, iNaturalist made the first kind of step towards thinking about putting out a kind of a data product right from this. So again, it's still very, I would say, incomplete, and there's a lot we can do to improve those models. But now we have like range maps from these models for 100,000 different species that are kind of available in easy to use formats and lots of different ways of kind of downloading them from iNaturalist. So worth taking a look at if you're interested. Yeah, and so as a result of that, we can do things like quantify range size and so on for species where that was not necessarily, or again, maybe bird's not a good example here, but yeah. And the other thing I think that's quite fun from this is now we can do stuff like anomaly detection. So we have some notion of a kind of like an estimated range from the species. And here's an example of this Duro spider where they had, which I guess is invasive maybe in the US, and they've had some recent observations from the kind of Boston area, and you can see that these are in regions that are highly unexpected according to the predicted range from the model, and so you can start doing things like flagging these unusual observations based on the current estimated range. And again, the models are kind of so compact and efficient to train that you can actually train these things very quickly, and so we can train that at kind of at a monthly frequency, so that we're constantly updating and bringing in the newest information that's available.
How much of a surprise was this spider? So can you make a hypothesis about where the invasive species came from? Like, was there a likely range, or did it just come in from a shipping container or something?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, yeah, the short answer, I don't know the answer to that, but I guess the cool thing about these cases is obviously there's not just an observation, but there is a visual record as well. Know that you have like you have a thing. So at one point I was looking at kind of these outlier species on iNaturalist, and sometimes you'll see like there'll be an image of like a southern alligator lizard. It's in Canada, and then so you'll see that it's like in the back of a truck, and so then there's a whole comment thread where people are saying, yes, I think this one hopped on the back of my truck and made it all the way up there. So wow. If it's not sometimes encoded in the imagery, often you have like a big interesting discussion from people around that. So there's actually probably a lot of interesting text that could go on in those kind of cases. Yeah, there's some really fun examples. Okay, so I'm gonna pivot a bit to some more recent work we've been doing to kind of to incorporate additional information into these models. But was there any questions on that last part of the talk? Yeah.
About like the geolocation.
Yeah.
How in iNaturalist you can change the location without any issue.
Yeah.
How can you make sure the observation was actually in the right place?
Great question. So yeah, there's a whole kind of like data filtering, data quality kind of concern and kind of a thing going on here. So, normally iNaturalist has this criteria, which is for something to be research grade, some small percentage of people have to agree on that. And that's actually pretty small. And so as a result, there will be mistakes in the iNaturalist data sets. And there could be cases where people will, maybe even incorrectly upload something to the wrong location, or they might adversarially do it. And so those things can definitely slip into the model. I guess the extent to which that's systematically happening is probably at the moment, hopefully not that much. So I think we're relatively robust to outliers in training sets like that, but certainly those cases will get flagged as outliers in this kind of anomaly detection.
You can also wait to have like research grade and then change the date or location.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I think there's, I think if that was happening at a systematic wide scale, the whole iNaturalist thing would be of concern. So I'm sure it happens, but my guess is that it's hopefully pretty rare. Yeah. Yep.
How do you account for species observed outside of their natural range, like something like ginkgo that's planted profusely and probably,
Yeah. So they have some kind of nominal, again, this is getting a bit outside of my expertise, but they have some nominal inclusion criteria, which is not be uploading cultivated examples, or you should not be uploading pictures of animals in zoos and so on. Obviously, people still do it. And so that does kind of pollute the data. But again, I think it's like probably partially managed to some extent, but I think there's a lot of that going on. So I think one thing we haven't done, and I think is rife for improving these models further, is a lot more careful data curation and selection to kind of hopefully remove a lot of those kind of extreme cases. But it's not maybe super clear to me how you would do that at this kind of like 100,000 scale setting.
The biological embeddings is a great idea. It basically solves a lot of the issues that we had with the previous version of SDMs, where we're based on spatial variables. My question for you is, how do you treat species, or how do you address species that may be biologically similar, may be able to use the same habitat, but that have different spatial barriers?
And so how would that manifest in terms of the underlying observations that we would get on for example, you're saying like you could have a case where the observations actually would be quite similar. But I mean, the point observations would be very similar, but ultimately the ranges are different. Is that what you're saying? Or
Well, I would imagine that observation-wise, you would have two groups of species. Imagine you have a group of species that are very similar and another additional species that clearly only occurs in part of the distribution, but not in the other, because there's some barrier that is maybe not observable.
Yeah, I wish I had a slide on that. Actually, there's some really nice examples of that. So, a downside potentially of learning this kind of joint embedding, that again, we fill in data gaps because of similarity, but you can start inferring similarity that isn't actually there. And so there's a nice example, I can't remember what species it was, where we have a bunch of things that have ranges that extend up into, like, let's say the north of California, but something else that extends slightly further. And so then, or sorry, no, it's the other way around. One thing that doesn't extend as far down, and it's getting over predicted because of that similarity. So I think that there's cases there that's, these mistakes can basically definitely happen. Yeah.
I don't think it's a mistake. Being able to identify when this occurs allows you to use the same model to predict both the realized and the potential range of species.
Yeah, it's true. You could view that as like either a kind of an exploited habitats or area for that species. At the very least, you can go back and look at places where, let's say, while it's only presence data, you can look at where there's lots of observation effort, because you know where people are uploading observations in general, and you can say, okay, have we not seen observations of this thing here? Why not? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's some interesting, maybe next level analysis that could be done, combining the raw initial data with the outputs. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so let's talk a bit about stuff that's kind of, I guess, a bit connected to this. So as an aside, we had a project recently, actually, with Mike here, who's in the room, and Philip Durham, who's one of a former MSc student in my lab, and we were trying to understand, we have all these LLMs, they can do all these kind of fantastical things, but to what extent do they actually encode any kind of ecological knowledge? And so what we did was we derived this kind of benchmark, which is things like species presence, producing actual range maps, threat assessment, trait identification. And so we wanted to then benchmark different models to see, can they actually do these tasks? And so for maybe people who are really into this kind of area, we're not actually training any of these models. We're just saying out of the box with some in-context prompt, can they do any of this stuff? And so just to give a highlight, I won't dwell on this too much today. The takeaway is, like, they're not necessarily great, but it's actually interesting that they're not that terrible, if that makes sense. So here's an example where the blue indicates IUCN range maps for these species, and the outputs of these models are, whether it's GPT or whether it's Gemini, are shown here in purple or yellow. So again, these models are asked to predict a range map, draw literally the polygon that this would be in. The fact that it can even do that, in my mind, is actually kind of mind-blowing, but it does show us that there's kind of like pretty, if not like complete yet, there's actually some knowledge encoded in these models about species, about their kind of geographical, preferences and their relationships to each other. And so we're, in this next piece of work I'm going to talk about in more detail, we are looking at ways to actually exploit this type of information that's already available to then improve our species range maps. Okay, so this was the model we looked at a second ago. Now, remember, we had a location encoding, And then we had an embedding for each species. And again, while it looks so complicated, it's actually pretty simple. We just have some MLP, some neural network that encodes a location, and we just learn a vector for each species. That's it. And so the question is, well, let's keep all this stuff the same, but could we come up with a different way of encoding an actual species? Right now, we just have to learn it with all the data that's available on iNaturalist, but maybe there's other sorts of information we can use to produce an embedding for a species. And one obvious source could be for that is text supervision. So, you can go online, and even if you just limit it yourself to Wikipedia, obviously you could go to like kind of journals or primary sources like that. There's actually pretty good information describing the kind of maybe you could think of it as like the range preferences or habitat preferences for species, and often that's just encoded in like relatively short and concise language, but actually that could be, in many cases, a lot richer than even a sparse set of observations that you might have, because it tells you really a lot about where these species might be found. And it's right now not in any kind of format that's useful that you could put into a more traditional species distribution model. Like, it's not clear exactly how you would even take that text and turn it into something that you could then use to train a more conventional model. But in our case, what we can do is we can attach a large language model into our model. So again, we can find the parts of the text in these Wikipedia articles that relate to the range. We can use a large language model to encode that text again into some kind of representation that our distribution model can work with. And then if we add all this piece back in again, so remember before we just had this encoding or embedding of a species, now we can actually just use text as input. So this could be a description of the species or its habitat preferences, and that produces the same vector. And so when I multiply it by my encoding of location, I can get again a high score if it's present and a low score if it's not. And depending on how I change then, or what I type in here, I'm going to get a different prediction. So I'll show some examples. I think it'll become more clear, but do kind of stop me if that doesn't make sense. So yeah, okay. So the idea being, now I can do stuff like I can take a piece of text, like saying, this thing here, yellow baboons inhabited blah blah blah, and I can look at the prediction of the model in that case. And so here's again the expert-derived range, and here's the prediction from the model. So this model has never seen any observations of this particular species. This is completely held out. It's kind of this zero-shot setting, it's called, in machine learning. And we can put this text as input and actually make predictions for something it's never seen before. And in this case, it seems to do something reasonably plausible. Again, it gets a lot of cues here. It's getting kind of country cues and so on, but we're getting something that's actually not too crazy. Yeah, Mike?
Just a quick question. So the LLM that you use here it's not a generally trained, it's not like a Gemini or something. Does it have background knowledge from elsewhere that's augmented with this?
It's a good question. So think of the LLM that I use, the one here. It's basically a kind of it's not one of these like gigantic LLM. There's something a bit more compact, and it basically takes any piece of text and it turns it into a vector. So it's not trying to generate language itself. It's just trying to encode text. It's a text embedding model. GridLM is the model if anyone's interested. So yeah, this model has been pre-trained. That's a great point. It's been pre-trained on general language and text from the internet, but we're then kind of fine-tuning it with some additional species information. So from about 40,000 Wikipedia articles. Okay, so that was, this example here. We can do this. But what's quite cool is that this model has basically then learned to spatially map concepts, so things like in the countries, for example, or habitat types and so on, they're appearing in a lot of this this text that it's trained on from Wikipedia when we have all these range maps. And so then we're able to actually like spatially map this knowledge that the model has onto a kind of a map and get some predictions from it. Again, this is not useful, but you can do stuff like then predict completely out of distribution things. So you could type in pasta and you can see where the model thinks pasta should be. But this is kind of one of my favorite ones, Hello Kitty. So you can see that really high probability in Japan. And so what's cool about this, I think, is it's not useful for ecology, but it shows you that the models have learned to basically, this model has never seen the word or concept Hello Kitty in any of the species range predictions, I would imagine. And yet it's managed to kind of leverage all of these connections and connect that new information to knowledge it already has. So I guess it sees lots of stuff about Japan in the range maps, and it then learns how to map Japan, but it also maps that to concepts that it hasn't seen before. So you get this kind of interesting property that the knowledge that's encoded in the model can be actually mapped out. Okay, so just a quick one on the performance. So this, I think, is a kind of direction we're pursuing a lot at the moment, which is we want to look at this kind of what we call few shot setting. So this is a setting where we only have a very small amount of observations for a species on the order of, like, you know, maybe even like as few as kind of 5 to 10. And we want to see how well the model can perform in this setting. In the extreme, we can also look at a case where we have no observations and all we have is a piece of text describing some range preferences. And so what we have here, you can kind of ignore all the other lines, but they're just different baselines and so on. But this green one here is a model that I described with the text as input. So you can see even without any observations in a traditional sense, you can still actually do a pretty good job of predicting ranges broadly. And then as we add observations to that model, we can actually improve the predictions even further. So again, this is quite cool, I think, to me, because we're getting in this really low data regime, and yet actually we're still doing something that's kind of broadly sensible. I'm not sure if it's like good enough for any kind of meaningful ecological analysis yet, but it's still like not terrible, and I think that's a kind of an encouraging direction. Okay, so looking at the clock a bit, so maybe have I got time for kind of 5 or 10 more minutes?
Absolutely,
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, so we've been building kind of on this few shot setting and trying to improve things further. I'll only just give you a bit of a glimpse of this because I think it's more interesting to probably look at the results of this model. But yeah, we looked at how we could take replace embeddings with actually language derived input, but actually there's other, more sophisticated ways we could think about encoding context. So the way I like to think about this is this information we're giving the model is context for what I want to ultimately spatially map. And yeah, that context could be in the form of language or text, but it could be in the form of locations, for example. It could be in the form of text, could even be in the form of images. So I want a kind of a general purpose module that I can ingest all of this information at inference time that I haven't seen during testing or training. And I want to turn that into some kind of embedding or representation of my species that then I map. So again, while this is looking a lot more complicated, ultimately think about this in terms of I want to be able to take information that's out there in different formats, turn that into some encoding of a species, and then use that to map that concept. And the nice thing about this module, or this way of working now that we have, is that we don't need to retrain this component up here at all at test time. Someone can start hypothesizing, okay, well, I'm going to write some text here saying some description of where this species might be. Maybe I could kind of imagine that I might have some observations here. What is going to be the consequence? What might the predicted range be for this? So you kind of have something that maybe with more development could be thought of as something like a kind of a hypothesis tool for kind of testing out, viable ranges for a species. Yeah, and so then we can quantify this. And so this red line is a kind of improvement of this model versus the one I saw a few minutes ago. So again, this is just a much more sophisticated way of incorporating the context, and this model is actually very efficient, doesn't require actually additional training. So I know I'm kind of glossing over that, but I want to do it just so we can look at some of the outputs of it. Okay, so this model, we can give it some observations in terms of location. So this is, give it this one single observation of, it doesn't know what the species is, and you can kind of see the prediction it makes. Okay, whatever, it's hard to know if that's sensible or not. But then we can actually condition the model on text. So we can say it's this location, but it has a preference for different types of habitats. That's what you see in these different options. And so you can see the kind of controllability of this model that now makes predictions according to this extra context that it was given. So I think something that would be very difficult to do in a more traditional species distribution model is to give it this kind of multimodal kind of control. And then we can do things like we can vary the number of locations. So we can say, here's some observations, few shot setting, and we can see how the model is kind of refining predictions as a result of these very small number of observations that it's presented. We've also started trying to incorporate imagery into these models. And so you can put an image into the model of something that it's never seen before. And you can see this is where the model thinks something like this would be. And obviously here it's kind of probably inferring cues also from the background and so on. So certainly images are not as informative as text, but it actually still does something sensible. And again, what's kind of not useful for ecology, but maybe fun in some ways, is that you can put in things that are completely unrelated to species, and it's still able to kind of, in some cases, actually do sensible jobs in potentially mapping, or at least broadly localizing this to somewhere in the world. So again, we're leveraging the kind of information or structure these kind of bigger, more powerful models have actually encoded to ultimately, hopefully, improve our distribution maps. Okay, so I will skip over this in the interest of time. So just to kind of wrap up, so, you know, I've talked a bit about some of the stuff that myself and my collaborators we've been doing. There's still huge, obviously, data challenges. Now, I've kind of glossed over some of the data biases that are there, temporally imbalanced and species-wise. And so I think there's a huge amount of things we can get and learn from kind of more statistical ecology works about modeling these observation processes, the biases in those processes, to try and correct for some of these errors in the models. Evaluation is a huge problem. You know, again, we have this problem that these gold standard expert range maps, I think while they're the best thing that's out there, they're still often kind of far from perfect, and we need a much more representative, globally distributed, taxonomically distributed set of those, so that people like my group who aren't ecologists and are not, you know, knowledgeable enough to make assessments about the qualities of our predictions can go away and make progress, and hopefully bring it back to people like you who know what you're doing. Yeah, starting to think about more finer grained ranges, so ranges that also incorporate things like the behavior or kind of seasonal patterns. I think that's something that is also of strong interest to us. And then another one is an obvious one. It's kind of reinforcing errors. So, you know, we don't want people uploading a picture of a panda becoming research grade in Vienna and becoming research grade in iNaturalist, and then that informing kind of poor range maps. You know, to some extent, we're hoping that the communities of people collecting this data are curating it and preventing some of these egregious cases. But some of this stuff can happen, and so that's obviously something we need to be mindful of. Yeah, so the takeaways I think here is that we can certainly generate, I think, plausible range maps from this really noisy and biased citizen science data. The reason that this works is because we're jointly training these models on multiple species simultaneously, and that does seem to help a lot. This auxiliary data, I think we're only kind of scratching the surface of this, but things like text, again, we've had some conversations today about like the other sources of text information that's out there, certainly imagery. I think they can really help kind of plug some of these data gaps and kind of bring these together. But there's obviously still a lot of big challenges to be addressed. Yeah, okay, so there's a bunch of references there. I have a link to my website at the end, and in case people are interested in any of the papers specifically, you'll find them on my website. A big thanks to the whole team of people, and there's a whole bunch of people as well that are not listed here, but Eli and Chris are kind of two of the main people that led a lot of this work, and then there's been a lot of help from the team at iNaturalist as well. Yeah, so with that, that's my last slide, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a great talk. Now we have time for questions. Anyone want to get started?
Yeah.
Thanks so much. That was really amazing. I want to ask like whether like a sort of similar approach would be able to predict like where species would be able to fade into. Like, is there any predictions of like the risk of species being invading into another country and that sort of stuff? Because that would be very helpful in policy wise, like to create this.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's a question, yeah, it's about like, could we predict where a species might extend its range? So, you know, you could think of maybe this encoding we're learning of location as some kind of like more abstracted habitat map type representation, or some continuous representation of that. So you could certainly think about using that to then understand whether species have an affinity for other locations. Right now, those maps have a kind of a spatially explicit information coded into them, and that's actually quite a good thing, because it means that we don't mistake desert-like regions in California for desert-like regions in Africa, for example. And so you need to decouple or remove that spatial explicit signal if you wanted to use that. But I think there could be some paths there. The other thing is maybe like thinking about extracting maybe some language-based habitat trait preferences from species and their habitat preferences, and then try to match those with other places. So I think there could be something like that done as well. So not sure if that's a good answer to your question, but some maybe ideas.
Yeah, super interesting talk. The question was around sort of, you talk about the imperfections of the data, which obviously is a big issue with citizen science data. If you looked at or integrate things from like occupancy modeling, so like some species are easy to detect than one another, some are cryptic. So building that in alongside where sort of you expect obvious species like in this country, like robins or blackbirds to be found. And then if they're not sampled there, then maybe that's not a good quality data point to sort of help inform detection ability of species.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think so. There's clearly like detectability that could be modeled more explicitly. So remember here, in these cases, a naturalist, we don't necessarily get a sequence of observations from someone in one sampling interval. We just get one. So we kind of have like quite an impoverished ability to say something about like their ability level or their quality of sampling. Also, it's not like maybe like an eBird checklist where you're trying to do something more exhaustive. Here, basically, people gravitate towards things maybe they haven't seen before, or that they're particularly keen on. So we have these huge kind of like people to tax biases and preferences. So I think we could encode that a bit more. We could say like, okay, maybe I never take a photograph of mushrooms, and so that could be kind of factored into it. So I think there's a lot to be done there. I think there is a fundamental issue, which is just we don't have enough data in Africa, China, and places like that, Russia. So that is like something that, as much as we can do careful modeling of it, we're not going to be able to overcome that. And so maybe that partially has to be addressed by integrating other sources, but also maybe those communities just hopefully growing in other places. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's really cool stuff. I mean, I particularly think that the text stuff is really interesting. And I mean, it might be fascinating to start looking at like historic texts, look at previous distributions and try and understand where species used to be in the past. So with something that sometimes worries me a bit with species distribution modeling is that it kind of assumes that species are in a state of equilibrium with their, and the reality is that often populations are places that are confined to extinction, and they are not in places that they will eventually be, and that they could currently be. They just haven't made it there yet.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and it's maybe because I don't really understand the kind of embedding stuff, the kind of location embeddings. Do you think your approach is kind of help to solve some of those concerns, or do you think it's still a kind of limitation of the method more generally?
Yeah, it kind of connects a bit, doesn't it, to the first question there? I think, so. I think the short answer is, I guess, like right now we completely entangle location in our encoding of space, and so I think that is a good thing for the models that we have right now. But you could think of like another representation, like a habitat map, that doesn't encode location explicitly, because different types of habitats can appear in different places. So I think there could be a way to think about disentangling some location explicit information versus some abstract location properties. So you could think of like lat long is location explicit, some kind of like habitat map is location agnostic. So maybe thinking about factorizing those things out more explicitly could be a way to start getting at that. But I think the challenge here is, I suppose, we don't have the training signal for, it could be there, but it just isn't, unless we could somehow link that to other species that have managed to kind of jump that gap, or do exist in that other place. They're both the same place here, but only one of them's over there. So maybe that could somehow inform that gap, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question, but yeah, I don't have further good ideas on that. Yeah.
I might have missed you saying this, so apologies if I repeated something that you said, but you mentioned that one of the ways you train the model was to look for species similar to, say, species X. You look for similar species and you kind of say, okay, well, that probably might be in the same location. But I was just wondering if you also looked at, because one species is in this location, that means that another species will not be there. So I'm thinking like grey and red squirrels in the UK, where you have quite a lot of competition.
Yeah, so short answer is those kind of co-occurrences, I think, are much more easily captured by the model, but like whatever the opposite of co-occurrence is not necessarily captured explicitly. And so I think it is interesting to think, like, I suppose you could think like, okay, in highly observed locations, if, X is observed and Y is not, we're getting some signal there about the fact that they don't co-occur. And so I think that there could be ways of thinking about it, but I think these kind of models, off the top of my head, I don't think they would capture that negative relationship particularly well, but it wouldn't be too hard necessarily to build it in. So good observation. Yeah.
So along the same lines, and if you've got a bunch of rare species whose existence you don't want to be revealed exactly, how would you how do you see that integrating to the more open data? So
Yeah.
how would more specialized people use this?
Yeah, good question. So I think like, so right now we only use, so there is data that gets uploaded to platforms like iNaturalist, which is sensitive data, and then they geo-obscure the locations. We only use the kind of public GBIF export that everyone has access to. Behind the scenes, so iNaturalist, they've taken our models and they kind of train their own versions, and they are presumably they get to use some of that data if it's licensed accordingly. So that does happen. The question to which could that data be extracted out of the model? I think there's a whole bunch of other questions like that around that. So yeah, short answer is people could easily take these models, adapt them, because we learned this rich embedding that you could treat that like your conventional features for a regular SDM and just train something on top of it. So you could do your own training, the extent to which you would want to add your data back into big aggregated sources and all that, and the concerns about it being leaking. I think that's another thing.
So they're two separate problems.
It could be separated, yeah, I think, yeah. Was there a question down the back?
I guess a question and a comment on the first point from the other person there.
Yeah.
I wonder if that would be something that you could citizen science code up so people could say, there's red squirrels here, what other species wouldn't occur here?
Yeah, I think that's it. So I'm definitely keen to think to what extent, like the way text, I think text is this really abundant source of information that can very easily be integrated. A lot of these other cues like co-occurrences and all that, I think they're there, aren't they? But they're there in very limited form. And so when we start scaling to this kind of now we're doing 100,000 species. Maybe if we're talking about 500,000 as the next target, that's just not going to exist. And so the extent to which we could get other proxies for that kind of stuff, I think that would be quite cool to incorporate, but I'm just not sure, what that would look like at the moment.
Did we have a question from the Botanic Gardens? Did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
No question. No.
No, you're fine. I'm just checking. From a lunch discussion.
There's a question online. I'm just reading out a question from John Crowcroft. It says, so what about proxies for species? For example, prevalence rate of Zika and dengue tells you about how many mosquitoes, Egyptus female, are there in the area.
Yeah, I think maybe this goes back to a bit of this co-occurrence. I think these kind of things are quite implicitly captured quite well at the moment, up to this kind of limiting factor we talked about before, which is sometimes there can be an over-reliance on that in under-sampled locations. So I think that kind of stuff, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is kind of captured in there.
But this is actually disease data or species, not co-occurrence of species, but disease and species.
Got it. Yeah. So, okay, yeah, we talked to some people about kind of the potential for disease modeling of this. You could think of this again, we have this really good encoding, even excluding the ranges of a kind of an ecological representation according to huge quantity of data. So I think that should tell us something about where certain things could find hosts and so on. And so we haven't looked at it. I think it's a cool direction, but maybe there's something there. Yeah. Yeah, you had a question, yeah?
Yes. At what spatial scales are you running your models now?
Yeah.
How long do they take?
Yeah.
At what spatial scales do you think you can get to? And how long do you think those would take?
Okay, good time questions. So the short answer is basically right now the models actually don't have a spatial scale because they take continuous lat long as input, and so there is no notion of discretizing space up. It just has a continuous representation of latitude and longitude as input, and it makes predictions off the base of that. Implicitly, the things that limit then the representational scale in the model is the capacity of the model. And then without getting into the weeds too much, it's to do with how we actually encode location information. So I think that in data-rich places where you see kind of so for example, we looked a lot at California, and I guess there's a huge amount of citizen science data there, and we're seeing kind of let's say you go off the Sierras and you see quite sharp transitions to something being present or not. We do see the models able to capture those kinds of things. Certainly, if we add in more additional metadata bioclim variables at a whatever resolution you want to use, then the model is going to latch onto those. But short answer is, without using any of that stuff, there is no explicit encoding of scale, which is a good thing because it means that it can kind of spatially adapt. In places where there isn't a lot of data, it can be blurry. In places where there is, it can get more refined. But there is going to be fundamentally some capacity or limitation, which will be the capacity of the model number of parameters in total and how we encode location into it. And so that's the first part of the question. Second part was how long does it take to train? Again, the cool thing about this is that it's very fast to train. So when we don't use any of the extra stuff like text and all that kind of things, even when we're training on millions of observations, it's just a small neural network. we can train it on a decent GPU in like a couple of hours, or not even a couple of hours, like 1 or 2. So it's actually very fast. And then to actually run it, so you can generate a map like this basically in, a second, I think, something on that order. But, these are not at like the really fine spatial scales that people are doing in other work. It's still kind of like a bit coarser, as you can see. Yeah, Mike.
We've got time and all.
Why don't we take this one offline? Let's because it's now 2 o'clock. Let's thank Rashid for a great talk, and he will be around for a little while. That was brilliant.